Imagine sitting down for Thanksgiving dinner with your loved ones, expecting laughter and gratitude, only to witness a single toast unravel the darkest, most twisted family secret. One so shocking, it leaves everyone shattered. What would you do if your world fell apart in front of everyone you trust? If this story has you on the edge of your seat, hit the subscribe button for more gripping true crime tales. And don't forget to share your thoughts in the comments. What would you do if you were in their place? The dining room was filled with warmth. The table gleamed with a perfectly roasted turkey at the center, surrounded by dishes that looked straight out of a food magazine. Family members chatted and laughed, passing plates and pouring wine. To anyone looking in, it was the picture of a happy family holiday. But beneath the surface, something wasn't right. Sophia, the wife, sat at the head of the table. Her smile was polite, but her eyes carried a heaviness no one seemed to notice. She occasionally glanced at her husband, David, sitting comfortably, laughing with their son, Ethan, and Ethan's wife, Emily. David looked like a man who had everything under control. He leaned back in his chair, his voice loud and confident as he shared an old family story, drawing laughter from everyone at the table. Emily, however, was quieter than usual. She kept her eyes fixed on her plate, only speaking when someone asked her a direct question. Her responses were short, her voice barely audible over the cheerful noise. Ethan, oblivious, smiled at his wife, gently squeezing her hand, but Emily barely reacted. Sophia noticed every detail, her grip tightening around her glass of wine. There was an unspoken tension in the air. Sophia had felt it building for weeks. Little things had begun to add up. Late nights David couldn't explain, secretive phone calls, and the way Emily had started avoiding her gaze. It wasn't until Sophia stumbled upon a text message on David's phone that everything became clear. The message wasn't just inappropriate, it was disgusting. It exposed a betrayal so personal it made her stomach churn. Sophia didn't confront David immediately. She needed to be sure. Over the weeks leading up to Thanksgiving, she pieced together more evidence. A second phone hidden in the garage, receipts for gifts she never received, even a slip-up from Emily herself when Sophia caught her sneaking out of the house one morning. It all painted a picture Sophia couldn't ignore. Thanksgiving dinner had become the perfect stage. Sophia had planned it carefully. She wanted the whole family present. She wanted everyone to hear the truth, no matter how ugly it was. As she sat there, listening to David boast about how he built a strong family, she knew she was only moments away from exposing him. Her hand shook slightly as she raised her glass for the toast. Sophia stood, holding her glass, her movements deliberate and steady, despite the storm raging inside her. The room quieted as all eyes turned to her. Smiles lingered on faces, unaware of the emotional bomb she was about to drop. Sophia cleared her throat, a slight tremor in her voice, but she quickly masked it with a calm and composed tone. "Thanksgiving is a time to reflect on what we're grateful for," she began, her gaze sweeping across the table. "Family, love, trust. These are the things that hold us together." Her words sounded heartfelt, but the slight emphasis on trust made David's brow furrow. He shifted in his chair, a flicker of discomfort crossing his face. Emily, sitting 2 seats away, seemed to sink further into her chair, her cheeks flushing red. "I want to say how thankful I am for all of you," Sophia continued, her voice growing stronger. "For Ethan, my wonderful son, and Emily, his lovely wife, who has brought so much joy into our family." She paused, letting the words linger. Ethan beamed, but Emily froze, her smile strained. Sophia's eyes stayed locked on Emily for a moment longer than necessary before moving to David. "And of course, my dear husband, David." Her tone softened, but there was a sharpness beneath it, like a blade hidden in silk. "You've always been the pillar of this family, a man we could all look up to, someone we could trust." completely. The room grew tense. The silence wasn't the comforting kind that comes from shared understanding, but the suffocating kind that foretells something going horribly wrong. David shifted again, his fingers drumming lightly on the table. "Sophia," he said, his voice low and warning, "what are you getting at?" Sophia ignored him, raising her glass higher. "Today I want to celebrate the truth," she said, her lips curved into a small, bitter smile. "Because truth has a funny way of coming out, even when people work so hard to bury it." She let the words hang in the air, glancing around the table to gauge their reactions. The smiles had vanished. Ethan looked confused, his head tilting slightly as if trying to piece together a puzzle he didn't know existed. Emily's hand trembled as she reached for her glass, avoiding eye contact. David's jaw tightened, his knuckles turning white as he gripped the edge of the table. Sophia looked directly at him now, her tone calm but dripping with restrained fury. "To my husband, David, for his loyalty, for his honesty, and for managing to turn our family into the kind of soap opera no one would believe unless they lived it." The glass in her hand glinted under the chandelier as she raised it higher, her voice steady but sharp enough to cut through the thick silence. "Here's to you, David, and your little secret, sitting right here at this table." Gasps rippled through the room. Ethan's eyes widened in confusion, looking first at his mother and then at his father. Emily froze, her glass slipping from her hand and shattering against the floor. David stood abruptly, his chair screeching against the hardwood. "Sophia, stop this!" he barked, but his voice cracked under the weight of fear. Sophia stayed rooted, her expression calm, but her eyes blazing. "I think it's time we all know what kind of man you really are," she said, her voice icy. "Shall we tell them, David? Or should I?" David's face drained of color, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. His usual commanding presence faltered, and the cracks in his composure became painfully obvious. The room felt like it had stopped breathing, every pair of eyes darting between Sophia, David, and Emily, trying to make sense of what was unfolding. Sophia didn't wait for him to respond. She turned her attention to the rest of the family, her voice steady but cold. "For weeks I've been noticing things, strange things, missing time, suspicious behavior, and—" She looked directly at Emily, whose face was now buried in her hands. Uncomfortable silences. Ethan, still clueless, stammered, "Mum, what are you talking about? What's going on?" His eyes searched Sophia's face for answers, but what he found was a sadness that cut deeper than anger. Sophia took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the edge of the table. "I'm talking about betrayal, Ethan, the kind of betrayal that tears families apart." She turned back to David, her tone growing sharper. "David, do you want to explain, or should I?" David's voice came out in a hoarse whisper. "This is ridiculous, Sophia. You're making something out of nothing. Let's not do this here." But Sophia wasn't backing down. "Oh, we're doing this here," she shot back, "because the people sitting at this table deserve to know the truth about you, about the man they thought they knew." Her voice cracked slightly as she continued, "Do you know how humiliating it is to realize the man you've been married to for 25 years has been sneaking around with his own daughter-in-law?" The words hit the table like a thunderclap. Ethan froze, his face a mix of disbelief and growing fury. "What? What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice louder now, tinged with desperation. Sophia's gaze softened momentarily as she looked at her son. "I didn't want you to find out this way, Ethan, but I couldn't let this go on. Not in silence." Her voice hardened again as she turned back to David and Emily. "You two thought you could hide it forever, didn't you?" Emily, trembling, finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not what you think." But the words rang hollow, and no one at the table believed her. David slammed his fist on the table, the sound startling everyone. "That's enough, Sophia," he shouted. "You're going too far." Sophia didn't flinch. "Oh, I haven't even started," she said calmly, pulling a small stack of papers from her lap. "Do these look familiar to you, David?" She dropped them onto the table. Text messages, receipts, photos, concrete evidence that left no room for denial. The silence was suffocating as the family stared at the damning proof. Ethan's face twisted in pain, his hands trembling as he pushed his chair back abruptly and stood. "How could you?" he shouted, looking first at his father, then at Emily. "How could either of you?" Emily tried to speak, her voice shaking. "Ethan, please, I can explain." But Ethan cut her off, his voice raw with anger. "Explain? Explain how you've been sneaking around with my father. Is there an explanation for that?" David, still standing, tried to regain control. "It's not what it looks like," he said weakly, but his voice carried no conviction. Sophia's expression hardened. "It's exactly what it looks like, and everyone here deserves to know it." Her words were final, leaving no room for doubt. The tension in the room was unbearable, the silence broken only by the faint sound of Emily's sobbing and Ethan's labored breathing as he stood there, shattered. Sophia remained standing, her head held high, while David, for the first time that night, looked truly defeated. Ethan's breaths came in sharp bursts, his chest rising and falling as he stood frozen. The betrayal clawed at his insides, making it hard to think, let alone speak. His eyes darted between Emily and David, as if searching for some sign that this wasn't real, that it was some cruel misunderstanding. But the truth was written all over their faces. "How long?" Ethan's voice cracked as he finally spoke, his fists clenched at his sides. His question hung in the air, heavy and sharp. "How long has this been going on?" David tried to interject, stepping toward him, his hands raised as if to calm the storm. "Ethan, listen to me." "No!" Ethan roared, slamming his hands on the table. Plates rattled, glasses tipped, and everyone flinched at the sheer force of his anger. "Don't you dare tell me to listen. I want the truth, not more of your lies." Emily buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably, while David stood there, his usual confidence shattered. The others at the table sat in stunned silence, too horrified to move or speak. "It's not what you think, Ethan," David said finally, his voice low and almost pleading. "I made a mistake, a terrible mistake, but it didn't mean anything." "Didn't mean anything?" Sophia's voice cut through like a blade, dripping with contempt. "You betrayed your son, your family, and it didn't mean anything. Do you even hear yourself, David?" Ethan stepped back, his expression darkening. "I looked up to you," he said, his voice trembling. "I trusted you. You were supposed to be the man I could count on, and this is how you repay me? By sleeping with my wife." His voice broke on the last word, and the raw pain in it made even Sophia's hardened heart ache. David opened his mouth to respond, but before he could, Emily spoke, her voice hoarse and broken. "Ethan, I'm sorry," she whispered. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I was confused, and—" "Confused?" Ethan snapped, his voice laced with disbelief. He took a step closer to her, his eyes blazing. "You're blaming this on confusion? You destroyed our marriage, our family, and you're calling it confusion?" Emily's sobs grew louder, and she crumpled in her chair, unable to meet his gaze. Ethan turned back to his father, his face etched with fury. "And you," he said, his voice venomous. "You're nothing but a liar and a coward. I don't even know who you are anymore." The tension in the room was unbearable, suffocating everyone at the table. Sophia, who had stayed silent during Ethan's outburst, finally stepped forward. Her voice was steady, but her words carried the weight of years of betrayal and hurt. This is who he's always been, Ethan. He just got better at hiding it. David's face twisted with anger, and he pointed a finger at Sophia. Don't act like you're innocent in all this, Sophia. You're the one who— Don't! Sophia interrupted, her voice firm and unyielding. Don't you dare try to shift the blame. This isn't about me, and you know it. David fell silent, his hand dropping to his side. The room felt like it might implode under the weight of everything that had been said. Ethan stared at the man he had called his father, the woman he had loved, and the mother who had exposed it all. His world was crumbling around him, and there was no escape. Suddenly Ethan's voice broke the silence again, quieter this time, but no less furious. You've destroyed everything, all of you. His words hung in the air like a curse, and with that, he turned and stormed out of the room, leaving the door swinging on its hinges. The sound of his footsteps fading down the hall was deafening in the otherwise silent room. Emily sobbed into her hands. David stood frozen in shame, and Sophia, though composed, felt the full weight of what had just unfolded. But she wasn't done yet, not by a long shot. The door slammed shut, and the sound echoed through the house, leaving a deafening silence in its wake. Emily's sobs filled the room, muffled by her trembling hands. Sophia stood motionless, her gaze fixed on David, her expression a mixture of disgust and triumph. She had exposed the truth, but the fallout was only beginning. David finally broke the silence, his voice hoarse and defensive. What were you trying to accomplish, Sophia? Ruining Thanksgiving? Destroying this family? His tone, once commanding, now bordered on desperation. Sophia let out a bitter laugh, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Don't you dare play the victim, David. You destroyed this family the moment you decided to betray us. She stepped closer, her voice lowering but losing none of its intensity. You thought you could get away with it, didn't you? That I'd never notice, that I'd just sit quietly while you carried on. David ran a hand through his hair, his frustration mounting. It was a mistake, Sophia. No, Sophia snapped, cutting him off. A mistake is forgetting to pick up milk from the store. This? She gestured toward Emily, who was now curled in on herself, her sobs softening to broken G. Gasps. This is a choice, a deliberate, disgusting choice. David looked away, unable to meet her piercing gaze. His shoulders slumped slightly, the weight of his actions finally bearing down on him. I didn't mean for it to happen, he muttered, but the words sounded hollow even to him. Sophia took a deep breath, steadying herself. Her voice softened, but the edge remained. You didn't mean for it to happen? Then what did you mean when you were sneaking around with our son's wife? When you lied to me, to Ethan, to everyone? She shook her head, her voice filled with sorrow. You don't get to justify this, David. Not anymore. The tension in the room was palpable. Emily, still seated, finally lifted her tear-streaked face, her voice barely audible. I'm sorry, Sophia. I never wanted to hurt anyone. Sophia turned to her, her expression unreadable. You didn't just hurt me, Emily. You hurt Ethan. You broke his heart, his trust. And for what? For him? Her voice cracked, and for a moment she looked almost as broken as her words. You were part of this family. I treated you like my own daughter, and this is how you repay me? Emily couldn't respond, her face crumpling as fresh tears spilled down her cheeks. Sophia took a step back, shaking her head as if trying to shake off the overwhelming emotions threatening to consume her. The air in the room felt heavy, suffocating. David opened his mouth to speak, but before he could, Sophia's voice rang out, sharp and cutting. Don't! Just don't, David! I've had enough of your excuses. The room fell into silence again, broken only by the faint clinking of a glass as one of the younger family members nervously shifted in their seat. It was an eerie quiet, the kind that made everyone uneasy, as if something even worse was about to happen. David suddenly turned his attention to Emily, his voice low and threatening. "You promised me this wouldn't happen," he hissed. "You said no one would find out." Emily's head shot up, her eyes wide with fear. "I didn't, David, I didn't mean for this to—" "Didn't mean to what?" Sophia interrupted, her tone icy. "Didn't mean to sleep with your father-in-law. Didn't mean to get caught." She stepped closer to Emily, her voice now calm but dangerous. "What exactly didn't you mean, Emily?" Emily looked between David and Sophia, her face pale. I don't know," she stammered. "I didn't want this to happen. I didn't know how to stop it." David's frustration boiled over, and he slammed his hand on the table. "Enough, Emily," he barked, his voice echoing through the room. "You're not helping." Sophia's eyes narrowed, and she took a deliberate step toward David, her voice steady. "Oh, she's not helping? Is that what matters to you right now? That she's not helping cover your mess?" Her laugh was bitter, almost mocking. "You're pathetic, David, truly pathetic." At that moment, something shifted in the room. The simmering anger, the raw emotions, the tension that had been building, it all reached a breaking point. David's face twisted with frustration, and for a brief second, a darker side of him flashed through, one that sent a chill down Sophia's spine. "You think you've won, don't you?" David said, his voice low and venomous. "You think exposing me makes you righteous, but you don't know the whole story, Sophia." Sophia's brow furrowed, her body tensing. "What's that supposed to mean?" David didn't answer immediately. He leaned on the table, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on Sophia. "You're not as innocent as you think, and you don't know what I'm capable of." The words hung in the air, heavy with menace. Sophia felt a shiver run through her, but she stood her ground, her gaze unwavering. "Is that a threat, David?" she asked, her voice firm despite the unease creeping into her chest. David straightened, a faint, humorless smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's a warning," he said simply. The room seemed to grow colder, the shadows on the walls more menacing. Sophia clenched her fists, her resolve hardening. Whatever David was hinting at, she knew one thing for certain: this wasn't over, and whatever came next would be darker than anything she had imagined. The sound of heavy footsteps thundered back toward the dining room, and all heads turned to see Ethan re-entering. His face was a storm of rage and despair, his eyes bloodshot, and his fists clenched at his sides. The room tensed even further, the atmosphere electric with anticipation. "Did you think you could just sweep this under the rug?" Ethan's voice was raw, barely controlled. He directed his fury toward David, who straightened but said nothing. "You ruined my life, Dad. You destroyed everything. And for what? For her?" His voice cracked, and he pointed toward Emily, who flinched at his words. David finally spoke, his tone low and almost pleading. "Ethan, listen to me. I never wanted to hurt you. It just happened." "It just happened," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "That's your excuse? You don't just happen to sleep with your son's wife. You don't just happen to betray your family." He took a step closer, his body trembling with the effort of holding himself together. "You're supposed to be my father, my role model. Do you know what it feels like to see you for what you really are?" Sophia tried to reach out, her voice calm but firm. "Ethan, you need to breathe. Don't let him drag you down with him." But Ethan was far beyond calming down. His gaze shifted to Emily, his voice quieter now but laced with venom. "And you. I gave you everything. I trusted you. I loved you." He shook his head, his voice breaking. "How could you do this to me?" Emily's sobs grew louder. but she couldn't find the words to defend herself. She looked small, fragile, as if the weight of her guilt was physically crushing her. Ethan turned away from her, disgust etched across his face. "I can't stay here," Ethan muttered, his voice hollow now. "I can't look at either of you." He turned toward the door again, his movements jerky and unsteady, but before he could leave, David's voice stopped him. "Ethan, wait," David said, his tone still laced with desperation. "You have to believe me. I never wanted this to happen. I made a mistake, but we can fix this." "Fix this?" Ethan spun around, his eyes blazing with anger. "There's no fixing this, Dad. You didn't just betray me, you destroyed me." His voice dropped to a whisper, filled with quiet despair. "You're dead to me." The words hit David like a physical blow, and he staggered slightly, his face pale. Ethan's final words echoed through the room as he turned and walked out for the second time, the door slamming shut behind him. This time, no one tried to stop him. Sophia stood silently, her gaze following Ethan until he was gone. Her heart ached for her son, but she kept her composure, unwilling to show weakness in front of David and Emily. The silence in the room was deafening, broken only by Emily's muffled sobs and the faint creak of the wooden floor as David shifted uncomfortably. David's mask of control had begun to slip. The confident, composed man he had been at the start of the night was gone, replaced by someone desperate, volatile, and dangerous. He ran a hand through his hair, pacing back and forth as if trying to think of a way out of the mess he had created. Sophia watched him carefully, her arms crossed over her chest. "You always think you can talk your way out of anything, don't you?" she said, her voice low and biting. "But not this time, David. You can't charm or lie your way out of this." David stopped pacing, his eyes narrowing. "You think you're so righteous, don't you?" he snapped. "You think you've won because you got to humiliate me in front of everyone. But don't pretend you're innocent in all this, Sophia." Sophia raised an eyebrow, her voice calm but cutting. "And what exactly have I done, David? Please, enlighten me." David took a step closer, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You've been pushing me away for years. You put your pride and your coldness above this family. And now you want to act like you're the victim? Like you're blameless?" Sophia didn't flinch, her gaze steady and unyielding. "This isn't about me, David. This is about you and the choices you made. Stop trying to make this my fault." David laughed bitterly, the sound sharp and unsettling. "You're so good at playing the martyr, Sophia. But let's not forget, you're not as perfect as you want everyone to think." Sophia felt a chill run through her, but she refused to show it. "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, her voice firm. David's smile was cold and calculating. "You think I'm the only one with secrets, Sophia? Maybe it's time we put all the cards on the table." The room seemed to darken as David's words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Sophia's heart raced, but she kept her face neutral, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Whatever David was hinting at, she knew one thing for certain. The night was far from over. Sophia's jaw tightened as David's words lingered, poisoning the air. She took a step forward, her eyes narrowing. "If you have something to say, David, say it. Don't dance around it like a coward." David smirked, his confidence beginning to creep back, but it was tinged with something darker, something dangerous. "You think you've got me backed into a corner, don't you? But you're not as spotless as you like to pretend, Sophia. Maybe you should tell everyone about your secrets." Sophia's heart skipped a beat, but her expression didn't change. "What secrets, David? If you're going to accuse me of something, at least have the decency to say it out loud." David's smirk widened, and he stepped closer, his voice low but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "Why don't you tell Ethan about the little friendship you had with your old colleague? Or should I do it for you?" Sophia felt a cold wave wash over her, but she stood her ground. "You're pathetic," she said, her voice steady. "This is nothing but a desperate attempt to shift the blame away from what you've done." David laughed, the sound bitter and mocking. "Oh, it's desperate, is it? So you're not denying it? How many nights did you stay late at work, Sophia? How many times did you come home with that guilty look on your face, thinking I wouldn't notice?" Sophia's voice rose, her composure cracking for the first time. "Don't you dare try to rewrite history, David. Whatever you think you know, it doesn't even compare to what you've done. Sleeping with our son's wife, betraying your own family. How dare you stand there and act like we're on the same level?" David took another step forward, his tone venomous now. "The difference, Sophia, is that I owned up to what I did. You're still hiding behind your self-righteous facade, pretending you're better than me." Emily, who had been silent until now, lifted her head, her voice trembling. "Please, stop," she whispered. "Just stop. This is tearing everything apart." David ignored her, his focus entirely on Sophia. "Tell me, Sophia," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "If you're so innocent, why did you look so scared just now? What are you hiding?" Sophia clenched her fists, her nails digging into her palms as she fought to maintain control. Her voice was cold and deliberate when she finally spoke. "I'm not hiding anything, David. But you are, and the more you try to drag me down with you, the more obvious it becomes." David opened his mouth to retort, but before he could speak, Sophia stepped even closer, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "Go ahead, David. Air whatever dirty laundry you think you have on me, but remember this, you started this war, and I promise you I'll be the one to finish it." The room was silent again, the tension so thick it felt like it could snap at any moment. David's smirk faltered, his eyes narrowing as he realized Sophia wasn't going to break. The balance of power had shifted again, and for the first time he looked unsure. Sophia turned away, her shoulders square, her head held high. But in the back of her mind, she felt the weight of David's words pressing down on her. She wasn't afraid of the truth. She had nothing to hide. But David's unpredictability, his growing desperation, made her uneasy. And deep down, she knew that the worst was yet to come. The tension in the room felt alive, crackling like static. David's uncertainty was short-lived as anger flooded back into his expression. His voice rose, harsh and unrestrained. "You think you're untouchable, Sophia? You think you can humiliate me like this and walk away unscathed?" Sophia didn't respond immediately. She turned slowly, meeting his glare with unwavering calm. Her silence only seemed to stoke his fury further, his composure unraveling piece by piece. "I gave this family everything," David bellowed, slamming his fist on the table. Plates rattled, and one glass tipped over, spilling red wine that bled across the pristine white tablecloth. "And this is the thanks I get? You, standing there, pretending you're some martyr? You're no better than me, Sophia." Sophia tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but piercing. "No better than you. David, I didn't tear this family apart. I didn't betray our son or humiliate my own wife. That's all you." David clenched his jaw, his hands shaking with suppressed rage. His voice dropped, taking on a dangerous edge. "You always loved to play the victim, didn't you? Always so perfect, so righteous. But you've been pushing me to this for years, Sophia. Years." The words struck a nerve, but Sophia refused to let it show. "Don't you dare blame me for your mistakes," she said, her tone sharp as steel. "Whatever excuses you have, whatever lies you tell yourself to sleep at night, they don't change the truth. You did this, David. You broke this family." David's expression twisted with rage, and for a moment the room held its breath. Emily shifted nervously in her seat, her tear-streaked face pale with fear. "David," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Please, let's just stop. This is—" "Shut up," David snapped, his anger spilling over as he turned on her. "You're as much to blame for this as anyone. If you'd just kept your mouth shut, if you'd been more careful, that's enough." Sophia's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. Her eyes burned with fury as she stepped forward, her body tense and unyielding. "Don't you dare take this out on her. You want to yell at someone, yell at me, but leave her out of it." David laughed bitterly, the sound filled with venom. "Oh, now you're defending her, the woman who helped destroy our family? You're unbelievable." "I'm not defending her," Sophia shot back, her voice unwavering. "I'm defending what little humanity we have left. You've done enough damage, David. Stop blaming everyone else for the mess you created." David's face turned red with rage, his body trembling as he struggled to keep control. For a moment it looked as if he might lash out physically, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. But then he stepped back, his breathing ragged, his eyes filled with something darker than anger. Desperation. "I won't let you take everything from me," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "I won't let you win." Sophia raised an eyebrow, her tone laced with disdain. "This isn't a game, David. There's no winning here. There's only the truth, and you can't handle it." David stared at her, his face a storm of conflicting emotions: anger, fear, hatred, and something else, something unspoken but heavy. He looked as though he might say something, but instead he turned and stormed out of the room, the sound of his footsteps echoing loudly as he disappeared into the darkness of the house. The silence that followed was suffocating. Sophia stood motionless, her chest rising and falling as she fought to steady her breathing. Emily sat frozen in her chair, tears streaking her face, while the rest of the family remained silent, their expressions a mix of shock and unease. Sophia finally exhaled, her voice quiet but firm. "This isn't over," she said, more to herself than anyone else, and deep in her heart she knew she was right. Whatever David was planning, whatever darkness he had let into his soul, it wasn't finished with them yet. The house was eerily quiet after David stormed out. The tension still hung thick in the air, suffocating and unrelenting. Sophia remained standing, her gaze fixed on the doorway where David had disappeared. Her mind raced, but her exterior remained composed, a mask she refused to let crack. Emily finally broke the silence, her voice trembling. "Sophia, I didn't mean for any of this to happen." She looked up with swollen eyes, her face etched with regret. "Please believe me." Sophia turned slowly, her expression cold and unreadable. "It's too late for apologies, Emily," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "You didn't just betray Ethan, you betrayed this family, and no amount of tears will change that." Emily flinched at the words, her shoulders slumping in defeat. The rest of the family remained frozen, unwilling or unable to intervene. The enormity of what had been revealed, of what had been done, left them paralyzed. A sudden noise shattered the silence. The sound of glass breaking, faint but distinct, came from somewhere deeper in the house. Sophia's head snapped toward the hallway, her instincts immediately on high alert. "What was that?" she said sharply, her voice cutting through the quiet. Emily shook her head, her fear evident. "I don't know." Without a word, Sophia moved toward the sound, her footsteps measured but purposeful. The rest of the family hesitated, unsure whether to follow or stay where they were. Sophia's heart pounded as she approached the source of the noise, her mind racing with possibilities. As she turned the corner into the dimly lit study, her breath caught in her throat. David stood there, his back to her, his shoulders hunched. The broken shards of a glass tumbler littered the floor at his feet, glinting in the faint light. In his hand, he held a small pistol, the barrel glinting ominously. Sophia froze. "David," she said carefully, her voice steady despite the fear creeping into her chest. What are you doing?" David didn't turn around. His voice, when he spoke, was hollow and distant. "I gave everything to this family, and now I have nothing." "You still have a chance to make things right," Sophia said, taking a cautious step forward. "Put the gun down, David. We can figure this out." David let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Figure this out? There's nothing left to figure out, Sophia. You've made sure of that." Sophia's eyes darted to the doorway, hoping someone, anyone, would appear. But no one did. She was alone with him, and the weight of the situation pressed down on her like a vice. "David, listen to me," she said, her voice softening. "This doesn't have to end this way. Think about Ethan. Think about the family." David finally turned, his face a mask of pain and fury. His eyes were red-rimmed, his expression twisted with a mix of guilt and despair. "The family?" he spat. "The family's gone, Sophia. You saw to that." Sophia held his gaze, her own resolve hardening. "No, David. You did this. You destroyed this family. But if you pull that trigger, there's no coming back. This will be your legacy. Is that what you want?" For a moment, David faltered, his grip on the gun loosening. But the moment passed, and his expression darkened once more. "I don't have a legacy, Sophia. Not anymore." Sophia took another step forward, her voice firm but calm. "You're wrong. You still have a choice. You can own up to what you've done. You can try to fix what's left. But this will solve nothing." David's hand trembled, the gun wavering slightly. Sophia's heart pounded, but she didn't let it show. "Please, David," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Don't do this." For a long moment, the room was silent except for the sound of David's ragged breathing. Then, with a sharp intake of breath, he slowly lowered the gun. His shoulders slumped, and the weight of his actions seemed to crush him. But just as Sophia exhaled in relief, a sudden movement caught her eye. Emily appeared in the doorway, her face pale, her hands trembling. "David," she said softly, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry." David turned toward her, his face crumpling at the sight of her. "Emily, Before he could finish, the gun slipped from his hand, clattering to the floor. The sound echoed like a final note, reverberating through the room. Sophia quickly stepped forward, kicking the weapon away, ensuring it was out of reach. The room fell silent again, the tension finally dissipating as David sank to his knees, his head in his hands. Emily stood frozen in the doorway, her tears streaming silently down her face. Sophia, standing tall and resolute, glanced between them, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. This wasn't the ending Sophia had envisioned, but it was an ending nonetheless. As she stood there, watching the shattered remnants of her family, one thought burned in her mind. The truth had finally come to light, and there was no going back. The pieces would never fit together the same way again, but at least now the lies were over,